Great. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, everyone. Welcome to the Accelerating Early Childhood Education in Crisis and Conflicts webinar, hosted by UNICEF, International Rescue Committee, the Global Partnership for Education, and Sesame Workshop. Throughout this one-hour webinar, you can submit your questions via the email address on the slide, gpewebinars@globalpartnership.org. These questions will be responded to in the post-event brief, which will be circulated to all registered attendees. We will begin our webinar today with the opening remarks by UNICEF, followed by a panel discussion and closing remarks by GPE. Now we will begin with opening remarks by Divya Lata from UNICEF. So over to you, Divya.
Thank you very much, Jennifer, and good morning, good afternoon, good evening to colleagues around the world. Welcome to this one-hour webinar on accelerating early childhood education in crisis and conflict settings. UNICEF joins GPE, IRC, and the Sesame Workshop to bring together national ministries of education from Jordan and Colombia, humanitarian and education partners, and education investors to highlight the evidence and urgent need for prioritizing funding, implementing, and evaluating quality early childhood education and development programs in crisis-affected contexts. It is a great pleasure to welcome you to this webinar. And we would just like to make a few opening remarks. And if you allow me, we are hoping our Director of Education would have joined us. Apologies that he got held up in another meeting. And I'm told he is about to join.
Global Director of Education for UNICEF. Apologies if others were also having some challenges with the technology. I think we're now through. I think maybe some of us also are having challenges with other competing meetings. Okay, others can hear. Great. Okay, let me just warmly welcome everyone. It's great to be here. This is, of course, an incredibly challenging time that we're all facing in many different countries and many different contexts, global pandemic related, but also recent developments in various countries, etc. I know everyone on this call is absolutely committed to early childhood education. We're all familiar with the data and how critical it is. We also recognize how critical it is in crisis and conflict settings and the importance of accelerating ECE in such settings. I'm going to take sort of, in a sense, make the assumption and encourage us all to acknowledge that coming to this seminar and being involved in this webinar, we all are bought into and recognize the importance of early childhood education. We also acknowledge how important it is in crisis and conflict settings. So that's sort of a starting point, if you'd like. And so I don't think need to spend too much time encouraging and reconfirming the importance, but rather moving to the how. How does one accelerate early childhood education in crisis and conflict settings, and what are best practices, and how do we mobilize others outside of this community that we're also critically involved in and engaged with to ensure a broader understanding of the importance of early childhood education, but also in sufficient investments in this area, and also the importance of collaboration in this area. What is interesting for me, and I'll just put on the table, is broader than ECE, we continue to struggle with enabling sufficient resources to education in humanitarian response. The percentages continue to be very disappointing. The proportion of resources allocated to education in emergency or education in humanitarian settings, education in crisis and conflict settings generally. So that debate needs to continue, and we need to continue to advocate with donors, with governments, with partners, the importance of enabling children to continue to learn in crisis and conflict settings and continue to prioritize that. Also, early childhood education within that. As we all know, global investments, we continue to engage on the importance of protecting and prioritizing early childhood education. generally in all settings, in all countries, high income, low income, development, and humanitarian, but also particularly in crisis and conflict settings. It is, I think, fair to say it is currently an irrational level of investment put it towards early childhood education across the world in general, recognizing the high return on such investment for children's learning, for lifelong earning potential, for contribute to development and social change, and for enabling children to reach their full potential. So again, thus we're all, I know, on this call familiar with that. The panel members are very much familiar with that. So I think the key emphasis I encourage us all now is to moving into the how, to enable, accelerate, how to accelerate early childhood education in crisis and conflict settings, and how to engage with others. Let me now pass over to, before I, let me just, I don't want to make another sort of technical issue. So can I see a number of colleagues are on the panel. Can I maybe just pass over to others who I'm worried that we're going to have another technical issue. Let me just pass over now and go on mute, and hopefully I'm not going to cause any technical issues.
That's all good. Thank you so much, Robert, for your remarks, for opening the panel, and also for your focus on how to ensure that ECE is prioritized in crisis within the broader education emergency responses. So today I have the pleasure to moderate the panel, and we have 5 distinguished panelists who will discuss 4 key questions around early childhood education. We are going to look at the challenges, the issues related to the how-to, the good practices, the partnerships that are needed, but also support to national systems and financing, which is one of the key ones. So without no more delay, I will start with the first question, which will take 10 minutes, and each panelist has 3 minutes to share their experience and their views. So the first question is around what are the challenges for providing early childhood education in crisis-affected context, and how these challenges compare to developing context or other levels of education. And this question will be addressed by the first 3 panelists, which is, we include Gustavo Gonzalez, who is the resident and humanitarian coordinator in the Philippines. We have Constanza Alarcón Paraga, Vice Minister of Preschool, Primary and Secondary Education from the Ministry of Education of Colombia, and Dr. Alia Arabiat, Childhood Director from the Ministry of Education of the Hashemite Kingdom of Jordan. Mr. Gonzalez, over to you to address the first question. The floor is yours. Please unmute.
Thank you so much. Thank you, Robert. Great pleasure to see you again, and Maria. Definitely, the first thing that we have to recognize is that the statistics, they are not reflecting this significant investment in ECE, which is, and I think that, Robert, you referred to that, is a call for enhanced advocacy. This is what we see from the field. And of course, we celebrate this debate. We know that 25% of the pre-primary age children live in countries affected by emergency, crisis, and just 1 in 3 was enrolled in primary education. And this is not just for countries that are facing shocks or crisis. If we look at the low-income countries, even before the COVID-19 pandemics, nearly half of all pre-primary age children in those low-income countries were not enrolled in pre-primary education. So definitely there is a problem that can be framed as a problem of governance. Certainly there is a problem of policy. There is a problem in terms of establishing priorities. There is a problem of funding, definitely, problems in planning. In the case of the Philippines, and before the pandemic, and despite the great efforts made by the government to increase the quality of ECE, we realized that still just 52% of 3 to 4 years old children were attending a school, preschool in 2019. And as we know now, as a result of the pandemic, enrollment rate decreased to 45%. And this is aggravated, as you know, now the Philippines is one of the 2 countries with the longest closing of schools since the beginning of the pandemic, and this is certainly affecting also early education. And we are working with the government, and this is the moment also to recognize the role of UNICEF and WHO, making sure that we have alternative options to this long lockdown. When we look at the humanitarian response, what we realize is that the funding of ECE remains largely absent in humanitarian response plans. And it's interesting because every time we try to plan here a humanitarian response, you know that the Philippines is affected regularly by typhoons. We have 21 active volcanoes, 21 typhoons, and we are entering into the season, earthquakes and conflicts in the south. Every time we try to plan for the child protection, you know, in child protection, you have these 5 indicators. The first one is making sure that it is good health, adequate nutrition. Number 3 is safety and protection. Number 4, response caregiving. And number 5, the most critical one, opportunities for early learning. This last component is frequently out of the equation, out of the planning. So, and this is a paradox, and I think that we don't need all of us to emphasize what Robert said, the enormous return if we invest in ECE. So this is the paradox. We have substantial evidence from neuroscience, from economics, that indicates that this early investment has impact on development, but we are facing this problem of funding at the level of the humanitarian crisis, or lack of establishing as a priority perhaps in normal development. We also know that early learning in crisis, and we have quite interesting examples, is the most effective way of creating some sense of normalcy that contributes, in fact, to the resilience of children. So, concluding, by not paying attention to this, that is for us a structural issue, we are compromising generation, but also we are compromising development prospects in the country. Over to you, Maria.
Thank you so much for sharing the experience from the Philippines. Now we are going to listen to Ms. Paraga, who will share experience from Colombia. Over to you.
All right. Well, thank you very much. I am Constanza Alarcón, Minister of Education from Colombia. Now, regarding the first question, I would just like to share 3 perspectives. First of all, when we look at what are some of the challenges for implementing ECE, especially during crisis situations, well, let me just refer to 3 key perspectives. First of all, looking at access to services, that's where we have a major impact, especially in primary education in Colombia. We have 2 major service providers as far as primary education. You have the Colombian Institute for Child Development, working from the very beginning up through the 4th year, and then children 4 years of age can receive these services up through 6 years of age. Now, because of the pandemic, we faced some very serious situations. Now, in terms of enrolling the youngest children, we've only been able to get about 87% of these children enrolled, 600 and 30,000 of those. We have actually 1,300,000 that have been 100,000 enrolled, receiving primary education. Then we also have, for example, those children that transition through the formal educational institutions. They'll go from preschool into kindergarten and first grade. That's under the Ministry of Education. 30 right now, currently, we have about 68% of those children enrolled. So we're working again with those children from 4 to 5. We have seen a drop in enrollment, and in fact, more than 22% of children have been impacted in terms of enrollment because of the economic impacts of the pandemic. We've seen them directly impacted, and here we're also talking about private schools, and they've had to close down some of the services because they didn't have the necessary financial backing. So these are some of the impacts that, again, are related to the 3 areas that I wanted to focus on. The second area has to do mainly with the family situations, not just in terms of the emotional and social needs of children. We know that in the early years, you have children developing their motor skills, their societal skills that are now being impacted. The quality of the interactions and the services are being affected. So when children are withdrawn from the educational environment, this is going to have very serious impact on their development. And some of them, in fact, if we don't intervene quickly, some of these effects could be irreversible in terms of their cognitive development and their social skills. And then we have another factor, and these are factors associated to the economic situation. The biggest impact has been as a result of the employment of women. As a result of the pandemic, women had to go back into the home, leave their jobs, and devote their time taking care of the children. So in the case of specifically of Colombia, this has been a huge impact in terms of reducing women's employment opportunities. So currently, the jobs available to women last year and this year have reduced. In fact, 1.4 million women have been taken out of the job market. 1 million men out of the job market, but 1.4 million for women. So this is having an impact as well in terms of primary and early child education. Women, again, are now having to provide direct support for their children because child services have been shut down. And another area that we need to address educationally has to do with the technological limitations in terms of working in early childhood education. Colombia is a country that has significant connectivity issues. And in that regard, it's important that we need to address that connectivity was not the only solution or the main solution in working with small children. You need to have that physical interaction. They have to be in places and to have that interaction for their development, in addition to the quality issues in working at home, for example, during the pandemic. This has had an even greater impact on young children because their key educational needs are not being met. So basically the connectivity was focused on adults, very little impact in working directly with young children. I just wanted to mention that last year in March, we have been completely locked down between March and June. From June to December of 2020, We tried to open up some educational facilities in some counties around the country, more than 150 experiences of reopening schools where children would go a couple of days, they would then go stay home. But by 2021, we began having in-school attendance in schools in January, and by June, it became mandatory. Well, thank you. Thank you very much, Sarah. So, in fact, we have a majority of now children that are attending classes. They're restructuring. They're looking at the jobs and actually attending classes in school, on campus attendance. So that's basically Colombia's experiences in terms of the impacts and the major challenges that we are facing in terms of early childhood education because of the pandemic.
Gracias. So we move to the next speaker, the next panelist, Dr. Alia Rabiat from the Jordanian Ministry of Education. And over to you to address the question around the challenges on the provision of education, early childhood education. Over to you, Dr. Rabiat.
أشكر دعوة الأردن لحضور.
Thank you for inviting Jordan to attend this seminar. Talking about the challenges we face in Jordan, I would start talking about the kindergarten and how much the numbers are of kids are there. I would say the percentage is 63%, which we considered as low. Jordanian were 69.5%, and the Syrian is like 45.5%. The number of kindergarten, the government institutions, is 70,588 kid. So we can say there is a big pressure on the Ministry of Education, and people are trying to stay away from the private organizations for kindergarten and going toward the government ones, which made what created more an extra challenge on us. And that's why the government now worked to employ more resources and to try to create like several shifts, like 3 by 3, 3 days in 1 week and in a certain time, and then they go on another time, another 3 days. And the government is trying and working harder to coordinate working with the private sector so we could make them more effective and helpful in complying with the increasing needs. One of the most significant challenges that in the last few years we were not really used and coordinated enough on the international level, and did not get the enough support and the appropriation of funds to enhance or improve our work, since we know the early years of any kids in the world is a very important stage to build a solid base in their knowledge for the future. And it is impossible for one entity to work by itself. It has to be also working with other entities and other sectors. Also, another challenge we face which is the limited kind of resources. We had only $6,700,000 which put to as a budget to in our ministry to support the kids and the organization, which is not enough at all. Also, we're facing another problem that bidding process is kind of slow. Especially that is usually the responsibility of the Ministry of Public Work. Another thing we face, the families don't have enough resources to make them capable of recruiting their kids into these organizations. Thank you very much.
Rabiat, for sharing the challenges you experience in Jordan. We move now to the next question, and I invite the speakers to try to address the question in 3 minutes. And the next question will be addressed by 3 speakers as well. And I would like to introduce Sherry Westin, the president of Sesame Workshop, Andreas Blum from the World Bank, is the education practice manager for the Middle East and North Africa region. And then we will hear again from Ms. Costanza Paraga from the Ministry of Education of Jordan. And the next question is about the how-to program models and delivery methods that are promising to meet the needs of children in a crisis setting. Sherry, the floor is yours. Over to you.
Thank you so much, Maria. And a thank you to UNICEF and the GPE for their leadership on this issue. So over the last 3 years, Sesame Workshop and our partners have embarked on 2 of the largest early childhood interventions in crisis contexts, where we're working in both refugee and host communities in Bangladesh and across the Middle East. And while COVID has forced us to adapt our programs like everyone else, the heart of our model has remained the same. What we're doing is we're creating educational media assets, and it's not just television shows, but storybooks, audio clips, and much more. And then we create local characters that children can relate to and storylines that reflect their daily lives, and then pair these media assets with the direct services of our partnerships. So, for example, in the Middle East, we're partnering with the IRC, and they take this new educational content, including an all-new Arabic television show, Ahlan Simpson, and they use it to connect with children and families. And it's really to help them weather the challenges of displacement, but also the added risk of COVID. And since we have had to shift, we cannot do the same in-person services, but we're able to use mobile platforms like WhatsApp and other mobile opportunities to still reach children and families during this time. And similarly, in the Rohingya crisis, we're working in both the camps in Cox's Bazar and the host communities, where we've made similar shifts. Our partner there is BRAC, and while they had originally planned to pair our media with the services in more traditional child-friendly spaces, our program is called Play to Learn, but we've since developed new ways also to reach children and caregivers in their homes through mobile devices. So basically, there are 3 takeaways I would love to share that we've learned from this work. First, we believe the model of pairing this media with the services is working. We're able to reach children, not only with new content that's specifically tailored to meet their needs, but we're reaching them and their caregivers through every means possible. And when we can't be in places like health centers or schools, as we have not been able to during the pandemic, we're still able to reach them in their homes. And again, it's by simple high-tech and low-tech, by phone, by other media and mobile platforms, and designed to provide playful learning opportunities and parenting support. I think, as Constanza just said, it's so important to have that quality interaction engagement between adult and child. So we think these new mobile opportunities and these models offer a lot of promise for reaching children in future crises. The second thing I'll say is flexibility really matters. You know, as the entire world has had to adapt to this new reality during the pandemic, you know, we've been fortunate that our implementing and our financing partners have really worked with us to pivot and pivot and pivot again. But we have to meet the changing needs and the changing conditions on the ground. And I think not just in a pandemic, but we've learned that this flexibility is essential for us as we create programming that's going to be available for future challenges. And lastly, I would like to reemphasize how important it is for us to reach the parents and caregivers as well as the children. You know, we know they serve as children's first playmates, as their first teachers. And obviously during this pandemic, in many cases, parents were the only teachers. So we feel that we cannot succeed without bringing those parents along and thinking of them as both a resource and a group with their own unique needs.
Thank you so much, Sherry.
Thank you.
Over to Andreas Blom now. Over to you.
Maria, thank you very much. And I would also like to echo Sherry and thank UNICEF and GP for organizing. In the Middle East, this issue of crisis, service provision and crisis for early childhood education is absolutely fundamental. We have active conflicts in Yemen, in Libya, in Syria, and serious instability in Iraq, but also occasionally in Palestine. And we know that it's the youngest children that suffers and do not have access to early childhood services. So it's a fundamental topic for us in the World Bank, in the MENA region. Now, we also know that there's lots of refugees and internally displaced. These will rarely be served by the traditional approach of institutional classroom-based early childhood education. We need to think new. We need to be, as was mentioned, more nimble, more flexible, and we need to go with partnerships, absolutely fundamental. And we need to reach the children and the parents where they are and where they already have access to. So we need to use primary healthcare facilities. We need to go to and work with health community workers, with social workers. We need to reach out to religious groups and communities overall, because we know that's where the families already are linked into and connected to. And then, of course, as was mentioned, new media ways, both TV, but also interactive apps, mobile phones, etc. So much more flexibility and reaching all the channels we can to help parents and children provide some level of stimulus. Then we need to go on the content, as was mentioned. Psychosocial support is critical to include in our early childhood education and stimulus. They have seen often traumatic experiences, and the more we can help them cope and talk about it, the more we have a chance that they will have more mental health and concentration and happy lives moving forward. So the content is critical. Most importantly for me is really leaving this if I may sum up, using all the channels that we can in flexible and partnership ways to move forward and provide early childhood services. Thank you, Maria.
Thank you so much for sharing your experience from the Middle East. Let's move to the next question, then we can come back to this one later. Next question is about first of all, why it is important, but also how we can better support national system strengthening and quality financing. As we have heard from the panelists so far, these are some of the key challenges that ECE faces in a crisis-affected context. And for this question, I would like to invite again Gustavo Gonzalez, the RC Resident Coordinator, Humanitarian Coordinator for the Philippines. Gustavo, are you there?
Thank you. Thank you, Maria. Good question. Can you hear me?
Very well.
Great, fantastic. As you know, in complex operation, in emergencies, in crisis, the way that the UN support communities, people, and governments through the humanitarian response plan. This is the, let's say, the main device that we have in terms of addressing the most immediate humanitarian needs. And at the same time, the humanitarian response plan is the tool that we have for resource mobilization. And it's quite interesting that, and I will share with you some figures. No, there was in 2018, there was a very well-known review of the quality of the humanitarian response plan. And the idea was to find what is the main focus that we are having, the way that we are portraying a crisis. And what is interesting with regards to ECE is that, and education, in particular education within the context of the humanitarian response, is nearly 50% of the humanitarian response plans made no mention of any learning or education for under 5 years old. And only 30%, it means 8 plans, included education for under 5, with a specific mention of pre-primary or early childhood care and education. 11 plans out of the 26 was the scope of the humanitarian response plan. 11 plans made no mention of any component of intervention related to responsive caregiving. No? As was referred by Sherry and Andrea, this is one of the key elements when we talk about the ECE. So that it's not just teachers, not just parents, it's communities. So, and only 9 plans included children under 5 in a strategic objective. So definitely we have a conceptual problem. We have a conceptual problem in understanding humanitarian needs, and we are practicing a sort of a very narrow approach, and particularly with an issue that is very much related to the development agenda of the country. So there is a change. There is a change. I think that for the last 3-4 years, and we are learning from crises like in Yemen and in Syria, there is a change. There is this sort of paradigm shift by the fact of including the needs of early education. In the case of the Philippines, we succeeded in including it as part of the UN multi-sector initial rapid needs assessment. It's also part, and this is the role of UNICEF, advocacy role of UNICEF, including it in the UN Emergency Preparedness Plan and the strategic plan. But even if you include them in those planning tools, doesn't mean that you are going to get the required resources. So the education sector, and I think that was referred by Robert, received less than 3% of the humanitarian funding. And with only a very small fraction of this funding that is allocated to pre-primary education. So as I mentioned, there is a conceptual problem in understanding needs, and there is also a problem on the way that resource partners are allocating resources to crisis. What we are learning is the way of changing that, first of all, is this new generation of tools. So, because everything starts with a need assessment. So now we have a new generation of tools that is based on the lessons learned that we have from other crises and allow us to consider the importance of early learning. Number 2 is that now we are structuring this sector, this subcluster, in a more consistent manner. I think that the examples that were provided by Sherry, by Andreas, in terms of the approach, in terms of this wide range of partners that are expected to take part in investing in EC in a crisis context, this is extremely important because we are bringing, let's say, additional tools on the way of implementing that. The third one is, and this relates to resource partners, is multi-year funding. Particularly when we refer to protracted crisis. And the last one is the importance of the linkages between the humanitarian response and the development agenda. So the fact that the early recovery is also making sure that this investment that we have in early learning in crisis context is sustained as part of the early recovery. So let me just stop here, if I may, Maria.
Thank you. Very, very, very interesting, very important points. Andreas, over to you again to address the same question.
Maria, thank you very much. So I'll take 3 points that I think are critical in order to really go from that initial emergency service into more national and development aspects. One, I think government ownership of refugees and internal displaced people are absolutely critical. We do have a number of countries that do not accept that there is a responsibility of helping young children get access to early childhood education. So government ownership, and I think, for example, Jordan, that we have as part of this panel, is exactly one of those good examples that they've said we use our national system to incorporate children, Syrian refugees into the system. So government ownership of internally displaced and refugees are critical. Second, the fragmentation is critical because we have all these partners on the ground, we have a fragmented system. So coordination is critical. And here we need both development partners like the World Bank, but also others, and NGOs and religious communities and the government to coordinate what we are doing and accept that it might not always be our way, but we need to work together. We have plenty of cases where we have oversupply of services in one location, and then we have undersupply other places. And that's where we need to coordinate, or some that want to finance food, others want to finance teacher training, and then we end up with gaps in this service provision. So coordination is the second big challenge that we all need to commit to. Third is, as Gustavo said, about the sustainability of the financing and moving out of a conflict, hopefully into a development situation, which is critical, where again, development partners have the World Bank an important role to play, but also government needs to step in with money. And in some instances, where possible, some element of cost sharing can be necessary for those that can sustain it. Let me just spend 1 second on the fragmentation, which I think is very important, because we do know that services and quality is not always the best in the crisis situation. So it's important that the government system and strategy is flexible to incorporate partners. And for example, in the case of Sesame Workshop, all the tools that have been developed for the crisis situation can serve for the national system. So a government that is flexible and looking to use those products and contents and learning material is very important to absorb into the system, and it's a large opportunity. But also some flexible licensing, perhaps have some models, PPP models that we are supporting in, for example, in Morocco and Palestine, with both private sector but also community driven, or small family daycares with just that meet the minimum safety. It's perhaps not the high quality that we all would like, but we have a minimum set of standards. So that flexibility and openness of the government strategy and policies is critical. But summing up, government ownership, overcoming fragmentation, and finance sustainability is critical. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you so much. These are very important points. Now we are approaching the time 9 o'clock, but we will extend because we started 15 minutes late. So we will continue until 9, at least at this time, Eastern time, 9:15. I would like now to give the floor to Dr. Arabiat to reflect on this point, and we have heard the importance of government ownership. Over to you, Dr. Arabiat, and please, if you can use your 3 minutes without exceeding them. Thank you.
So our strategy has allowed students access to education, and we expanded our services and the efforts of parents to support education and health and safety throughout the kingdom. We also trained the parents about the importance of their role in supporting childhood. The Ministry of Education also in its strategy dedicated a special access for childhood and stressed its importance. So we are coordinating our strategies. With respect to why I should focus on this issue, it's understood, it's well known that early childhood education is important. And there have been many studies that have supported the importance of such education. There are indicators that allow children to play a more positive role in the future. There's another point, which is there have been studies that demonstrated that 40% that the gap between children who join ECE programs and those, it bridges the gap between those and students and low and middle income and high income students. And this was a study by the Rania Institute, Queen Rania Institute, which studied the economic effects of investment in ECE in Jordan. And this study demonstrated that there are many benefits that we can summarize in the increase of average education by 8 months per person. So this study also demonstrated that there will be a return on investment by $29, and the future return on taxes would also increase. This is a very important point. This investment would provide 300,000 future jobs and will guarantee the entry of women into the labor force. I would also like to stress the importance of responses to in the terms of ECE, especially in crisis, that we have to strengthen national systems so that they would not contribute to the increase of the gap in a country, but to use the allocations to also improve the infrastructure and to ensure sustainability and to focus on what is existent and investing in initiatives and engage in partnerships and increase allocations. Of course, we have examples of our accomplishments by the Ministry of Education. So we have refugee children who have managed to join these ECE programs, and the ministry brought together all the donors, and we have allocated a special budget for this program, and we managed to enroll children in this program, and we had very positive outcomes. We have also enrolled children with disabilities and from refugee camps, and we had very positive outcomes. And we actually use this study and its findings to guide our policy. This is just a quick summary of what we've done.
And the time is so limited. It would be really good to have more time and hear more from all of you. So thank you. We are now approaching the last question. And the last question gives you just 1 minute to share your reflections before we conclude. So, and the last question looks at the importance of partnerships and also the most critical partnerships and lessons to ensure that early childhood education is provided in crisis-affected context. And I would like to start with Sherry. Over to you, Sherry, for your last remarks.
Thank you, Maria. I'll be very brief. No, I think partnerships are so key, and we are so fortunate to be partnering with the IRC and BRAC in our initiatives. But I would also reiterate how important it is for us to partner with parents themselves. You know, that this really needs to be a two-way street. We learn from parents what is most important for their children, but we also know that they have their own needs, and we have to focus on their mental health and their needs in order to make sure they're in the best position to help their children thrive. So in less than 1 minute, I would say that we need to think of parents as partners as well.
That's wonderful. And as a parent, I can only agree with you. Thank you. Over to you, Andreas, for your last remarks.
Thank you. Let me then follow up on that and say to reach parents, I think from the World Bank perspective, one of the lessons we have is we need to work more with Ministry of Health, Ministry of Social Development, that already have programs reaching out to vulnerable families, and work with them to provide parental education and support for taking care of their kids is one of the key lessons I have. The second one that I think we really need to move forward more on is education technology and using those opportunities that lies in there beyond what was already mentioned on partnerships and reaching out to NGOs, etc. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Very important points as well. Over to Ms. Paraga for your last remarks. About connectivity, I'm sorry. We might be lucky, and Ms. Paraga will join again. Over to you, Dr. Arabiat, for your last remarks.
هلا
With respect to partnerships, it's very important for them not to be executed in isolation of all other projects to respond to crisis. And we have to find ways to intervene in health, education, children protection, and to establish national coordination mechanisms at the national level, and to also engage the families and parents in health and education at home and in school. We have to also support families so that they can help in the development of their children's skills and abilities. Experiments carried out by the ministry with coordination with the World Bank and the Ministry of Education and Ministry of Trade and Commerce and the International Red Cross and other early childhood institutions. We have also we evaluated the impact of the cognitive and emotional development on children in early childhood. There is also a platform known as Darsak, Your Lesson, which is a partnership to educate teachers. And we had also a partnership with IDRAC, a training institute for teachers. There was also a partnership between the ministry and organizations like AID, USAID, and the Planned International, the German Institute for International Cooperation. So we received support from AI and other organizations. And we also studied ways to reach low-income children and refugee children, and other programs focus on continuing to measure the ability of students in Jordan to learn. So we want to bring Jordan, to put Jordan on the international map in coordination with UNICEF. We also support the National Early Childhood Education Development Committee. So, and also with the Family Affairs National Committee. So because of course ECE is important and we're trying to coordinate and make sure that all our time is, and to coordinate with all these institutions. And I had to be brief here, sorry.
Challenge today, the brevity. Thank you. Over to you, Gustavo, for your final remark before we summarize.
Excellent. Thank you, Maria. And there are two points related to the learning and related to partnership. The first one is related to the positioning of early childhood education in humanitarian response plan, and of course in development agenda when we are in development settings. So I think that for all of us, those that we have who have a coordination responsibility, advocacy, policy responsibilities, we have to ensure that the ECE is embedded in humanitarian need assessment, in humanitarian response plan, and this should be a priority. And of course, on the side of the resource partners, no donors, they must be part of this change. And the second lesson is, and I'm happy because what we are learning from the field here in the Philippines is very well reflected by the experts in this panel, is that the ECE, the early childhood education, requires an holistic approach. This is quite different from other type of humanitarian interventions that not only include support from teachers, parents, caregivers, communities, all of them, they have a role in ECE. And we know that in some crises, this is particularly in Africa, no? ECE is a less formal service that is conducted under community-driven modalities. So these are the two lessons. The last one and the first one also requires what was emphasized today, Maria, is this strong emphasis on partnership, no, to better position ECE. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much. Thank you. Very important points, and it's been really important to hear all the different perspectives from the Ministry, the World Bank, Sesame Street. And allow me to briefly summarize what I've heard from all of you, which we can summarize really in a kind of 5 recommendations on the way forward. So starting from what you just said, Gustavo, is ensure that early childhood education is visible in humanitarian needs overview and humanitarian response plan. We know that if we don't have early childhood, any part of the education sector and any sector reflected in those plans, everything falls apart, from financing, prioritization in terms of programs, working with partners and so on. Linked to this one, the importance of having ECE in humanitarian response plan, the linkages with development actors and government programs. And we heard from Dr. Arabiat, from Andreas from the World Bank about the importance of working with other line ministries, Ministry of Social Welfare, the Ministry of Health, the Ministry of Education, so that those interventions are really multi-sectorial, are sustainable, and ensure equity. So all vulnerable children can be reached through different modalities. The other important point that has come out throughout your interventions, the importance of supporting parents and caregivers. And what Sherry said, yes, we need to focus on early childhood, but the parents are the first teachers, are the ones who are there to support, and we need to support parents to be able to support their children, and also support parents because in those circumstances, especially in emergency, they have also need for mental health, psychosocial support, and other type of help. The other element which came also very, very strong throughout the interventions is the government ownership, supporting national systems, and the importance of policy, so that there can be a linkage between development intervention, development programs, humanitarian response plan, and government ownership, which is key to ensure sustainability. And let's not forget, children grow. It's not a one-off intervention. It has to be multi-year, sustainable, and accompany children through their development process. And from here, and this is my last point, is really the importance of quality financing. And when we talk about quality financing, is about multi-year, unearmarked, so that we don't have all the impediments that sometimes funding creates. 1 year financing is not going to support for that sustainability. And my final point, which touched me very personally, it's coordination, reducing fragmentation and partnership. As the Global Education Cluster Coordinator with UNICEF, I am really happy to, we have talked so much about the importance of tools, having the right tools for needs assessments, right? Having the right tool for the HRP. We are working on that even more, and I'm really happy to share that the Global Education Cluster new strategy for 2022-25 will prioritize early childhood education and youth. And in order to support those interventions in the field, provide the tools and the advocacy and the policy that is required. I would really like to thank you, and I'm sorry for some of the hiccups we experienced today with technology, but it was really a great opportunity to discuss and prioritize, support the prioritization of early childhood education. And now I would like to give the floor to Jo Byrne from the Global Partnership for Education for your final remarks. Jo, over to you. The floor is yours.
Thank you, Maria Agnesi, and I'll be very brief. But thank you, first of all, to all of the speakers, all of the participants, and the co-organisers with GPE, so IRC, Sesame Workshop, and UNICEF. And let me just briefly also acknowledge the partnership between UNICEF and GPE and many country partners who have been engaging in the ECE Accelerator Toolkit, which we have talked about previously. And it's really good to see how this is being adapted now to humanitarian and crisis situations. We've heard a lot today. I won't repeat it about the importance, obviously, of investments in early childhood, particularly for children affected by trauma, but also a number of promising practices and principles in terms of how we move forward. And I guess I've got kind of 3 takeaways, and these are going to be quick. My first one, listening to the panel, is a number of you have talked about what I might coin as some sort of political will. And by that, I mean it in a very broad sense. It's that will of governments to give priority to early childhood education in all situations. And we certainly heard that from our colleagues from Jordan and Colombia today. But also, as Andreas talked about, that importance of ownership of refugees within context, including for early childhood education. That is one of the most important things we probably would look for around political will. But we also heard about the will of the humanitarian community, particularly around the response plans. Little or no funding going to early childhood education within a humanitarian response plan. And that really is very distressing when we hear all the evidence about how important it is. So, we all have a role to play there to raise our voices in terms of making sure that we are changing that narrative in humanitarian situations. Certainly from GPE's perspective, as many of you know, we have a new strategy, and much of our approach is to listen to the will of the partners on the ground in all contexts. And if the partnership on the ground wishes to focus on early childhood education, including in fragile states, we will certainly work with partners to align efforts, to unblock obstacles, to crowd in funding and partnerships where we can, but making sure, of course, that they are really specific to the context and flexible. The second thing I heard loud and clear, and you all did as well, was this power of partnership and the importance of collaboration. And we heard many different types of partnerships being mentioned, between families and communities, between the humanitarian and development actors. I totally agree with what was said there. The importance of reducing the fragmentation, partnerships with private companies, with technology. So really important messages here just about the partnership, the collaboration, and really being aligned and pulling together behind a national response. And the third thing, which we didn't quite hear, but I'd like as a takeaway for us, is I'm hearing a real sort of thirst and interest to continue the conversation and to continue to exchange knowledge and ideas around what is possible, particularly around sort of bridging the development divide and accelerating progress on early childhood education, which quite frankly is so important for, both those immediate needs of children in crisis situations, but also, as we've heard, for the long-term prospects of those communities and those countries. So with that, I will, I think, wrap up and say thank you to everyone.
Thank you, Joe, and thank you everyone again. The webinar is over.